And then I began to look into it further, and I found that there were many, many federal, state, and local policies, uh, equally racially explicit, that were designed to enforce, maintain, and sustain residential segregation. I concluded in the book, The Color of Law, that de facto segregation is utter nonsense. There's no basis in reality to it whatsoever. We live in a state-sanctioned, unconstitutional, segregated society that all of us have an obligation to remedy. Well, let me spend a few minutes today with you describing some of the most powerful policies the federal government followed to ensure that we be a segregated society. Perhaps the most powerful of them is a policy of the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration in the World War II years and post-World War II, designed to move the entire white working class population out of urban areas into single-family homes in all white suburbs. It was an explicitly racial program. Many downtown urban areas were integrated at the time simply because we were a manufacturing economy, none of this internet stuff. Most jobs were involved in manufacturing. Factories needed to be located near deep water ports or railroad terminals to get their parts or ship their final products. And if a factory district was employing both black and white workers, they had to live in broadly the same neighborhoods because they were walking to work or taking short streetcar rides. So the federal government decided it was going to move the white families out of these urban areas into single-family homes in all white suburbs. Perhaps the most famous of these is Levittown, east of New York City. I spent some time in The Color of Law talking about this one. 17,000 homes in one place, a new suburb. A crazy idea, people thought at the time, because we weren't a suburban country. The only people who were living in suburbs at the time were the affluent. Middle class, working class families were living in urban areas. Levitt, the builder, William Levitt, could not get the capital to build his development. No bank would be crazy enough to lend someone the money to build such a crazy thing as 17,000 homes away from the city. The only way Levitt could get the funds to build that project, to buy the land, was by going to the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration, submitting his plans for the development of the materials he's going to use, the architectural design, the layout of the homes, and an explicit commitment never to sell a home to an African American. The Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration even required that Levitt place a clause in the deed of every home, prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. This was an explicit racial policy of the federal government. It wasn't the action of rogue bureaucrats. It was spelled out in the federal policy manual called the Underwriting Manual that was distributed to appraisers all over the country, whose job it was to evaluate the applications of builders like Levitt for federal bank guarantees to proceed with their projects. The manual prohibited the recommendation of a federal bank guarantee for a developer who would sell homes on a non-discriminatory basis. The manual went so far as to say that you couldn't even give a federal bank guarantee to a developer of an all-white project if that project was going to be located near where African Americans were living. Because, in the words of the manual, that would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. That's what the federal policy manual said. As I said, this notion of de facto segregation is utter nonsense. A white noose was created around every metropolitan area by this explicit racial policy. Those homes, in places like Levittown, and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them, they ring every metropolitan area today, a white noose around Black communities. Every one of those homes were inexpensive. They were designed for working class, middle class families, many for returning war veterans. They cost at the time, Levittown, for example, about $8,000. In today's money, that's about $100,000. Any family, returning war veteran, Black or white, or someone with a job in the post-war economy, Black or white, could afford to buy a home at that price, especially for returning war veterans who were required to put down no down payment in purchase of these homes. Well, as you all know, those homes no longer sell for $100,000 today. They sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. In some places, $1 million or more. The white families who were subsidized by the federal government with this program to move into these homes. It cost them $100,000 with 30-year mortgages and no down payment. They gained over the next few generations equity from the appreciation in the value of their homes, going from a $100,000 purchase price to a $500,000 value is a $400,000 gain in equity and wealth. Most families in this country who have any wealth get it from the equity they have in their homes. The white families who gained this wealth through a program from which African Americans were explicitly prohibited from participating, they used that wealth to send their children to college. They used it to take care of temporary emergencies, maybe medical emergencies or unemployment. If you're temporarily unemployed and you have wealth, you can weather that temporary unemployment. If you don't have wealth, you're pushed further down the economic scale, you're evicted, you're foreclosed upon, you have difficulty surviving unemployment. The white families used that wealth to subsidize their own retirements, and they used it to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans, prohibited from participating in this policy, gained no such wealth. The result is that today, African American incomes on average are about 60% of white incomes. There's a whole story behind that. I don't have time to go into it today, but unconstitutional federal policy is also in good part responsible for that income gap. But if you have a 60% income gap, you'd think that you'd also have a 60% wealth gap. People can save the same amount of money from the same incomes. But in reality, although African American families on average have 60% of the income of white families, African American families on average have only 5% of the wealth of white families. And that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 5% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century that we've never remedied, that we've never accepted even an obligation to remedy. Well, that wealth gap is a big contributor to the continuing segregation in this country today. This isn't just a matter of history, of interesting history. The wealth gap predicts the segregation that we have today. Families, African American families living in urban areas, have no down payments for homes in more highly resourced communities. That wealth gap that we created in an unconstitutional fashion is in large part responsible for the achievement gap that I talked about before by concentrating the most disadvantaged young people in single schools and single neighborhoods. It's responsible for health disparities between African Americans and whites. African Americans, as you know, have shorter life expectancies on average, or greater rates of cardiovascular disease because they live in more polluted neighborhoods in large part, without access to grocery stores that sell fresh food. It's responsible in part for the mass incarceration crisis that we're all familiar with and for police abuse of African Americans that we've spent so much time demonstrating about in the last few months. I'm not suggesting that police would never discriminate against African Americans if it weren't for the wealth gap and if it weren't for them being segregated in separate communities. But the discrimination would be much, much less when we concentrate the most disadvantaged young men in single neighborhoods where they have no access to jobs or to the transportation needed to get to those jobs or to schools with high achievement. It's inevitable that those young men will be engaged in confrontations with the police who are there to control them, who are there to monitor and control a low-income minority neighborhood. The police role in our segregated communities, low-income communities today in this country, is no different from the role of police occupying forces in colonial India or the Congo or any other colonial situation in the 20th century. And the wealth gap and the segregation that we've created with it is also responsible for something that I regard, and perhaps you do as well, the very frightening and dangerous political polarization that we have in this country today that's probably never been greater. It's not entirely racial, but it largely tracks racial lines. How can we ever expect to develop the kind of common national identity that we need to create a common allegiance to a democratic society if so many African Americans and whites live so far from each other that they have no ability, we have no ability to understand each other, to empathize with each other, on the basis of which a common national identity can be created. Those are the consequences of this unconstitutional policy that we followed.